What's up, everybody? It's George Gabriel, and this is In the Mix. And today I'm going to introduce to you the T.A.B.S mixing workflow. So I polled a bunch of you and asked what is the most important thing you wanted to focus on, and the overwhelming answer was how to get my mix to sound better. With that, I wanted to share something with you that I've been using for years that's really elevated my mix to be record quality, and that is what I dubbed the T.A.B.S mixing workflow. So what is T.A.B.S? It stands for tracks, auxiliaries, buses, and stereo out. And what it really is it's the signal path that you should be using to get the most optimized, best possible sound for your mixes. Now, how was this inspired? It was inspired by working for years in studios with big consoles, and really it's the original studio flow, which is we're working on a console, we're using channels to bring up our instruments, and then when we want to affect the instruments, we're using auxiliary sends that are going to outboard gear with reverbs and delays and those kind of things. And those reverbs and delays are coming back into the board on an aux return, which we can label a bus for our purposes here because we're dealing with how this is being set up in Logic. And then everything is going to your master fader on your board, which the equivalent in Logic is our stereo out. Now, I have a multiple part series on how to set up an auto load that reflects this in Logic, but this is kind of a prerequisite video on why we're setting it up like this in Logic. Now let's take a look at my auto load in Logic to see what I'm talking about. So here in my auto load, you will see that I have my tracks set up on this side, and I have my audio tracks followed by my software instrument, followed by my multi-timbral instruments. Then on this side, the lower screen here is my busing system. So what I'm doing is I'm collecting all of my regular instruments, my tracks, into buses. So if I have multiple tracks of drums, I'll put them on a drum bus, or if I have multiple tracks of loops, a loop bus, or my electric guitars will go on the guitar bus, so on and so forth. And what I'm doing is I'm collecting like-kind instruments because what I want to do is I want to compress and EQ these on the bus level because those like-kind instruments have the same timbral qualities. For instance, drums and percussion have a certain frequency footprint and they have a certain type of attack and release versus a guitar and maybe a piano or vocals for that matter. So I'm putting things that have certain frequency footprints, like-kind instruments, same performance values into these collected buses where I can compress and EQ them properly. On the top here, I have a set of auxiliaries. The first set of auxiliaries are my mic pre's. If I want to monitor them directly, I can listen to them through here. You'll notice they're muted. But the second set of auxes are my effects. And much like on a mixing board, I'm setting these up so you can actually use your sends on the track level to send to the effects like you would on a mixing board where you're actually sending a portion of the signal of that channel to a reverb or a delay, and that effect is essentially 100% wet. That means it's all effect, no direct signal, just like it is on a mixing board. Now, because we don't have auxiliary returns in Logic, what we're going to do is we're going to dump down these auxiliary effects into an effects return bus down here below. And all my buses are going to a stereo out. A couple other things I have going on here are side chains, and that's in case I want to globally affect a drum kit or a guitar or something like that, or if I'm doing some electronic music and I want to use some side chain ducking for whatever purpose that I'm using. But it's important to note that the way that my auto load is set up is using tracks affected with auxiliaries, collected in buses, and then those buses are going to my stereo out, where here I will have my mastering chain. I think one of the most common mistakes made in Logic is that people go from tracks to stereo out, and they're not using effects properly. You'll note that if you bring up a reverb on a track, it will make it about 30% wet and 70% direct signal. That's by design. But that's not how you do it in a studio. In a studio, you actually have a 100% wet effect that you send a portion of that signal, use an auxiliary knob to go to that outboard gear, reverb, or delay, and then you're bringing it back in on an aux return that is completely wet, and you're bringing that into a mix. And you have control over that auxiliary return. Therefore, once you put in all your instruments, and if you start losing some of the drum reverb or whatever, you have the option to turn that auxiliary return up. Thus is the same concept with having my effects return bus in this, where if you bring everybody in and now, geez, I don't really hear that reverb on my drums anymore. Let me just turn the overall reverbs up. But the point really is not to go from just tracks to stereo out, because what happens is everything kind of gets muddled. You can't really collect everything together. You can't separately compress everything together. Yes, you can compress them all on the track level, but that's a waste of plugins. It's much better to put like-kind instruments into a bin or a bus and then compress and EQ them accordingly to their kind. This is what gives you that record sound, where you can actually take these groups of buses that are collections of instruments and properly EQ and compress them so they pop within themselves, so when they're added to the full mix, it becomes much clearer what's going on. A lot of people's mixes are muddied up because there's too much low end, there's too much fighting and all that kind of stuff on frequency levels, and this gives you the option to really control those frequencies on the bus level and not have them all just be going to your stereo out. I assure you, if you use this system, you'll clearly hear the difference. Now, a couple things to note on this. You'll notice that my buses are all at -12. That's because collectively, if they were all at 0, I'd be blowing up my stereo out pretty heavily. So I start with -12, and sometimes I take them down to -20 depending on what instruments I'm using or how many things are in the mix. However, you'll notice that my effects auxiliaries are all at 0. Now, sometimes if I'm losing one particular effect, like let's say I'm using my effects for reverb here, and that's affecting my drums, if I'm losing that a little bit, I can always goose it up here. But all of these are being collected down here. So that's the overall structure of the T.A.B.S mixing workflow, but there is one more thing that I do want to bring up, which I'm going to bring in part 2, and that's how to use effects properly. What do you think about this mixing structure? Leave your comments below. I like to dialogue back and forth with you. And if you like this video, give it a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel and click the bell icon to be notified for new videos. And I'll see you on part 2 of the T.A.B.S mixing structure on George Gabriel Music.